The American Adoption Congress, 13th International Conference, April 11th to the 14th, 1991 in Garden Grove, California. This is program number D151, tape 15.
And I'm a birth mother, an adoptee, and a family therapist. And in 1988, I did a survey on birth mothers about unresolved grief. And I had 135 birth mothers in my study. And I'd like to know if anybody here was in that study. One. I was hoping I'd meet a lot of the participants at this workshop, because I talked to people on the phone and wrote letters, but I didn't get to meet too many of them face to face. How many birth mothers do we have here? Any adoptees? Adoptive parents? Professionals? Good. I have an awful lot of information, so I think what I'll do is run through it rather rapidly and then save some time at the end for questions and discussion. The long-term impacts of relinquishing a child can have a profound impact on the life of the birth mother. Oh, before I get going, I should say also that I had a reunion with my son about 10 years ago, and I found my birth family 2 years ago. My birth parents were dead, but I found a full brother who's 18 months younger than me, and we look like twins, and 4 half-brothers and sisters who are older than I. So it's, and I don't know, something about when you search, you're so focused that you don't think about the reality of it all, and I ended up with over 50 relatives just with one phone call, and I still haven't recovered from it. The relinquishment of a child has a profound impact on the life of the birth mother. This impact continues throughout her life. The impact is in many areas of her life, from her relationships with her family of origin, her partners, and subsequent children, to her emotional stability, her sexuality, her career, her self-image, and even perhaps to her fertility. In 1988, I did a study of 135 birth mothers. They filled out a 40-page questionnaire, and I salute every one of them for going through that process. Fortunately, I think the questionnaire served as a therapeutic intervention for most of them, because one of the things that problems birth mothers have is remembering a lot of the events, and the questionnaire was so comprehensive that it took the birth mother through the entire experience from before the pregnancy clear up to the present day, and it helped to put it in a kind of chronological sense for the participants, so I was glad that it helped a lot of them in that way. Most of the women in my study relinquished their children 18 or more years ago, yet their pain is described as freshly as if the event had happened yesterday. While search and reunion do much to help resolve their grief, search and reunion do not in and of themselves resolve the grief the birth mothers feel. Indeed, it is questionable whether it is possible to resolve their grief. When a child dies, the parents may never fully recover from this loss. Similarly, the birth mother may never fully recover from this experience. And I think it's important to recognize that and to not have expectations of ever being fully healed. You're going to be disappointed. You think you're doing something wrong if you don't succeed in healing this wound completely. I don't think we ever can. And I think it's important not to have those false expectations around it. That's why I chose this title, Resolving the Unresolvable. Finally, meeting the child and forming a relationship does assuage some of the grief. The birth mother now knows that the child is alive. However, the grief may take on a new form, as now the birth mother becomes even more aware of how much she missed by not being a part of the child's growth and development. Search and reunion do allow the birth mother to express her grief openly, perhaps for the first time, in support groups and in her family relationships, to acknowledge her relinquished child and her own maternity, and to break the conspiracy of silence which has prevented her from working through her grief to any extent for so many years. Thus she becomes empowered through commencing to search and takes control of the situation, a situation she felt was not within her control in the past. And her self-esteem is greatly enhanced. She is validated through her contact with other birth mothers and adoptees. Let us look now at the unresolved grief of the birth mother in more detail, keeping in mind that hers is a unique situation, and she cannot be expected to go through the grieving process as others do, for her child is not dead. It is alive somewhere. This fact in itself prevents the full working through of her grief. In my study, 97% of the birth mothers showed unresolved grief. There are 3 types of unresolved grief: absence of grief, delayed grief, and prolonged grief. Part of us fell down over here. In the absence of grief, one has the feeling of going numb and having no reaction. I think many of us in the first months of relinquishment felt this type of grief. The birth mother is actively encouraged to repress her grief, even though this goes against all psychological knowledge. Therapists and social workers are well aware of the dangers of repressing and denying emotional material, yet they have for years encouraged the birth mothers to do just that, with serious consequences for all of us. To repress a major emotional onslaught like grief can wreak havoc with our emotional and physical health. Some of the psychosomatic symptoms include headaches, loss of appetite, increased appetite, back and neck pain, insomnia or sleep disturbances, including difficulty falling asleep, obsessive thinking, frequent waking or fully awakening after a few hours, sleeping long hours without feeling rested, unpleasant dreams, suicidal feelings. And a lowered immune system makes us susceptible to many infections and diseases, including Epstein-Barr and environmental illness. And these psychosomatic illnesses and symptoms can continue throughout our lives. By psychosomatic, I don't mean it's all in your head. It's a very definite physical symptoms, but it can be caused by the grief. The suppression of grief can incapacitate us by causing our emotions to be deadened or distorted. Our relationships can suffer, and our functioning can be impaired. It can also lead to intense depression. 16% of the birth mothers as a whole showed an absence of grief. Of those who had neither searched for or had a reunion with their child, 38% showed an absence of grief. This may be due to the continued suppression of feelings. Since they have neither searched for nor reunited with their children, it is very possible that their grief, rather than being absent, is still being denied and repressed. Indeed, the vehemence with which some insisted that they had no grief suggests this interpretation. For some, admitting that they had grief would imply that there was something wrong with their decision. And the only way they can live with the decision to relinquish is to believe that it was for the best and to feel no grief in connection with it. I think the most important thing to remember is that mourning is necessary even when the decision is quote-unquote right. These birth mothers still have not allowed themselves to feel. It is too painful. Of the birth mothers with a reunion who did not search, none of them showed the absence of grief. They all had unresolved grief. Of those with search but no reunion, 8% showed an absence of grief. And of those with both search and reunion, 18% showed an absence of grief. A second category is delayed grief. And delayed grief is the pushing aside of feeling at the critical early stages of mourning to be dealt with at some later time. This is the most common type of unresolved grief for the birth mother, and 53% show delayed grief. Delayed grief is simply bottled up pain that will erupt with its original force at some later time or in some other area of our lives. Delayed grief always leaves us open to unexpected emotional explosions. Also, losses, especially unresolved ones, have a way of piling up so that each new loss brings up all the previous losses. We may find ourselves overreacting to relatively small losses, due in a large part to the unresolved grief over the relinquishment. Of the birth mothers in my study, 53% of the total showed delayed grief. Of those with no search or reunion, 44% showed delayed grief. And of those who had a reunion but did not search, 86% showed delayed grief. These are the birth mothers whose children found them. They had not gone through the process of search, and being found made them especially vulnerable to an explosion of grief. They were suddenly confronted with the grief they had so carefully hidden all these years. Their defenses were destroyed in one fell swoop, and the grief came surging up. Of those who searched but had not had a reunion, 50% showed delayed grief. For some searchers, the full impact of grief is still withheld pending reunion. Of those who had searched and had a reunion, 54% showed delayed grief. Now, keep in mind that all of these forms of grief are forms of unresolved grief. While one might think reunion would alleviate grief, instead it may at first increase the grief of the birth mother. While in the past her grief was for the lost infant, being confronted at last with the adult child, she may become aware for the first time of the true enormity of her loss. For she has lost not only her infant, but all the intervening years of growth and development. Thus, even though she may have accepted her decision to relinquish, meeting the adult child and learning of his heartaches and life problems may call that decision into question all over again, bringing up new feelings of guilt that must be worked through. So for a while at least, the grief may be even more intense and must be worked through all over again. This is why this loss may never be truly resolved. The resolution is a lifelong process. The third type of unresolved grief is prolonged or chronic grief. The opposite of unexpressed grief, this grief remains prominent in our lives beyond the loss. The normal, quote-unquote, grieving period is considered to be 1 to 3 years minimum, as one must go through all the anniversaries at least once before grief can begin to be resolved. 28% of the birth mothers as a whole showed prolonged grief. Hidden feelings, too painful to face, are often the underlying cause of prolonged grief. These feelings may include ambivalence, resentment, and guilt. We continue living amid the intensity of our sorrow in order to block off other unacceptable feelings. It is often extremely difficult for people who have lost a loved one through death to express anger at the dead person, anger for their leaving. It is even more difficult for a birth mother to own her anger and resentment of the child. Most of her anger, if acknowledged at all, is directed at the birth father, her family, the agency, or society in general. If she feels anger toward the child, she feels even more guilty. Thus, it is easier to concentrate on the sorrow rather than deal with the extremely ambivalent and unacceptable feelings that may otherwise emerge. Of the birth mothers who searched and found, 23% showed prolonged grief. Of those with no search or reunion, 13% experienced prolonged grief, And of those with a reunion but no searching, 14% showed chronic grief. Of those who had searched but had no reunion, 42% experienced chronic grief. This number is probably so high because of the search process. Searching takes great courage and brings up many previously repressed issues. We must constantly assure ourselves that we have the right to search, that it is the right thing to do. All our hopes and dreams are centered on finding our lost children. Some issues are just too painful to deal with, especially until we know all the facts. So we put them on the back burner to be dealt with when the time comes. This is largely an unconscious process. That is, we're not aware of doing it. The frustrations involved in search make agencies and government regulations an easy target for our anger. And while this anger is, in my opinion, almost totally justified, it is also safer to direct our anger outside ourselves at this point. We need all the self-protection we can muster to see us through the difficult journey of search. During the search, we grieve over and over. Each fresh bit of information brings new grief. During my research, I came across a concept that I feel is very useful in thinking about the grief resolution process of the birth mother. It is a concept described by R.J. Knapp in Beyond Endurance, When a Child Dies, published in 1986. The death of a child, according to Knapp and others, is the most difficult to come to terms with, and may in the end be unresolvable. While the initial pain lessens, the parents' grief continues throughout their lives in a form which Knapp calls shadow grief. I feel this concept describes the grief of the birth mother, which may never be fully resolved. Shadow grief is, in shadow grief, the individual can never remember the events surrounding the loss without feeling some kind of emotional reaction, regardless of how mild. This type of grief varies in intensity from person to person, and thus will be more emotional for some than for others. But it is characterized as a dull ache in the background of one's feelings that remains fairly constant, and that under certain circumstances and on certain occasions comes bubbling to the surface in the form of tears or other manifestations, but always accompanied by feelings of sadness and anxiety. This concept describes my own feelings very accurately, especially prior to my reunion with my son. I remember saying to people after the reunion, for the first time in my life, I feel the right to be happy. The dull ache in the background of my feelings was always there, no matter how well my life was going, no matter how much in love I was. There was always the feeling of grief and sadness that took the edge off my enjoyment of life, which did not allow me to fully feel and experience the moment, to be in the present. While this shadow still exists since my reunion, it is far less prominent, and I can now give myself permission to be in the moment and to enjoy much more fully whatever I am experiencing. So while we may work toward and achieve considerable grief resolution in regard to our relinquishment, ultimately it may be truly unresolvable. Perhaps it will be helpful to view it in this light, to put aside the expectation of full resolution and work toward resolving as much as we can. Relinquishing a child, for whatever reason, is an event of extreme sadness, and that sadness will be with us all our lives. However, there is much that we can do to help ourselves live happy and productive lives. And I asked the women in my study to what had helped them the most in their resolution of grief. And first on the list was reunion with the child. Knowing the child is alive and well, searching for the relinquished child, support groups, talking with other birth mothers, therapy with a therapist sensitive to the issues of relinquishment, reading relevant materials, acknowledging grief and loss, talking honestly, revealing the secret, forgiving themselves, and religion and spirituality. I think one of the most difficult ones for birth mothers is often forgiving of oneself. Other people forgive us, our children forgive us, but we don't forgive ourselves. When I ask what would help that they had not, what help they wished they'd had but had not received, first on the list was reunion, then information on their children, support groups, therapy, pictures of the child, and acknowledgement and acceptance from the child's adoptive parents. That's one thing that I have never gotten from my child's adoptive parents, which I would like to get. And somehow I haven't been able to ask for it. It seems like such a simple thing. You'd think it would be the first thing an adoptive parent would say to a birth mother is, "Thank you for your child." But I think very few of us hear that. It is supremely ironic that the birth mother who has given up her child so that another family may have one is then condemned by the very society which urged her to do so. She is told on the one hand that if she truly loves her child, the best thing she can do is to give up that child. When she does give him up as an expression of her deep love, she is branded unnatural and heartless. Instead of being appreciated for her gift, her sacrifice, she is feared and resented by those who are most in her debt, the adoptive parents. She is condemned to live on the fringes of society, keeping her past and her pain secret, living in fear that she will be found out. Secrecy may be one of the biggest single problems in the entire process. Secrecy comes from the need to protect and to be protected. Agencies are intimately involved in the entire secrecy process, ultimately deciding what all the parties have a right to know. All members of the adoption triangle experience shame and guilt, and secrecy evolves as an attempt to guard against one's own shame and guilt, perhaps more than to save others from pain. Adoption is a lifelong process for all sides of the triangle, and all three need support groups and ongoing counseling. One thing we should remember is that reunion is a beginning, not an end. We think of it as an end, but it launches us into a process that we never dreamed would happen. And it continues, I guess, as long as we're alive. It's been going on for me for 10 years, and I don't expect it to end. Open adoption has the potential to lessen the traumatic effects of adoption on all concerned, but nothing can prevent it. Recovery means the restoration of our capacity for living a full life and enjoying life without constant feelings of guilt, shame, sorrow, or regret. While ultimately the grief of relinquishment may be unresolvable, there is a tremendous amount that we can do towards resolving our grief, toward accepting ourselves, forgiving ourselves, and giving ourselves permission to be happy, to live in the present, in the now. I'd like to share with you a poem by Confucius. When I finished my dissertation, I threw the I Ching, and I got a number that had this poem in it. I since have looked through the book, and I can't find another number that has a poem in it. And it seemed to me to be the perfect poem for birth mothers, and I used it, I sent it out with the summaries that I sent to the participants. Life leads the thoughtful person on a path of many windings. Now the course is checked. Now it runs straight again. Here the heavy burden of knowledge must be shut away in silence. But when two people are one in their inmost hearts, they shatter even the strength of iron or of bronze. And when two people understand each other in their inmost hearts, their words are sweet and strong, like the fragrance of orchids. Let our words be sweet and strong, like the fragrance of orchids. Now we'll talk. Any questions? Yes?
A copy of the poem?
If there's a Xerox machine.
Could you elaborate more on the what goes into a birth mother's anger towards her child? I guess I don't understand how. I don't relate to that as a birth mother, being angry at my child. How does that work?
Okay, they asked me to repeat the questions to elaborate on the birth mother's anger at her child. I think if we search our hearts, there were times during the pregnancy when we were very angry with the idea of being pregnant and of that child existing. That may not be true for everybody, but anger and resentment and about the whole thing. And ultimately, if the child hadn't existed, we wouldn't have had to go through all this pain. It may not be a real personal anger, but I think there is some anger in connection, direct connection with the child's existence. Yes, Barb?
Well, I think that even goes farther as far as birth mother's anger. I think that sometimes, I know for myself, I'm angry that I had to give him up because I had to sacrifice what I wanted and what I needed, which was my child, so that he could have a better life. I was told that that was the ultimate sacrifice. He needed the better life, so I was the one that had to pay for it. He got the better life. I got stretch marks. Okay, for the rest of my life. And so I do think that there's an underlying anger that birth mothers feel for the child.
Yeah,
I had a reunion with my birth mother, and in many ways it's very positive. It's been a healing experience for both of us. But I also sensed at one point that she was, some of her anger, I'm sure she had a lot of anger, but one part of it was because she was older, she was like in her mid-70s, and when I found her, and I sensed her anger at having been found in a way. Even though she was always talking about me, family members, and wondering if I would, come back and this kind of thing. There was a part of her that now she had to deal with it, what it all meant, and I'm sure, stirred up a lot of feelings and caused her a lot of problems because I was asking her for more time with her and things like, it was a disturbing experience, although it had a healing aspect.
yeah.
So I think she tried to shield that anger from me, like I try to shield my anger from her too.
Right. Everybody's still protecting everybody else. Yes.
I agree with you about the thank you. I've always wanted, I've never been able to understand why the adoptive parents of my son were not able to say thank you. Those are the two words I will probably die waiting to hear. I think the issue of anger between the mother and the child is a really important one. And somehow the children that I parented, not my child who was adopted, but the two that I parented, we get angry at each other all the time. It's no big deal. I mean, that's part of being a parent. And yet, I think that my son may not get angry at me. Either he won't get angry at me ever, or we'll get angry with each other, and then, for openly, I'm sure he's angry with me in his own heart, but he has never said it to me. Or else we will get angry with each other and it'll clear the air and then our relationship will move to a different level. I'm not sure. I don't know the answer. When I first was reunited, I thought maybe there was a difference in love. For example, we all have an unconditional love toward all of our children, regardless of what they do. But when you parent a child, you have a responsibility to teach them how to survive in society. So there are certain conditions put on a child by a parent. But I never parented him. And so it's a different feeling. But the anger is something that is just so unresolved right now.
Your anger toward him or his toward you?
I think both. I think the fact that we're not able to express anger to each other. He goes out of his way to be nice. But that's not real.
Yeah, how long have you been reunited?
2 years.
2 years.
It's a
Could that
short
be
time.
that they're afraid that you might, if you get angry at each other, maybe somebody's going to leave the
Sure.
relationship?
Sure. Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, in regards to that, I think that's really an interesting question. And what came up to me when I was having those sorts of things going on with my son is that what we were trying to avoid was passion. And there was a lot of passion, there still is, passion between my son and myself. And anger is one of those passions. And the next time I see him, which will be soon, that's one of the things I want to sit down with him and ask him to breathe, not to be afraid of our passion. We don't have permission to hurt each other, but we shouldn't be afraid of our passion with each other. Because it's the fear of passion that I think holds up some of the grief process. To own our passion, the passion within all this, that was certainly one of the things this cat Bob was tight because they were products of passion.
One of the big issues too for both birth mothers or birth parents and relinquished children is trust. And you can't expect that trust to build instantly. It takes a long time and we can't express our anger toward each other until we trust that it'll be handled well, trust that it won't mean the end of the relationship, trust that we do love each other, and that can take a long, long time. Yes?
I'm a social worker and working, with relinquishing parents. One of the big questions I've had from just what I've heard since I've been here is how can we as agency people working with newly relinquishing parents help with some of this so that, there's not so much absence of grief, there's not so much delayed grief. How can we help them early on to work through some of the anger, the denial?
See that they get some counseling, see that they're encouraged to talk about the experience and not to repress it. Now they're going to want to repress it in the first few months a lot. And part of the problem in the past has been there's been very little follow-up for support for birth parents. So the more follow-up, I would say after 6 weeks, to really try and get them into groups, into counseling, where they can really talk about this experience and have them, if possible, talk about it with their family of origin. Most of the women in my study had not talked about it with their parents from the day of relinquishment. It had been silence until the search began or even after that. I never talked about it with my mother. I told her after the fact. She said nothing, essentially. And it wasn't until after I brought my son home as a grown young man that she finally was able to say anything about that must have been a hard experience for you. And my father was dead at that time, but we never spoke of it at all. And I know that was not a unique experience. So that the more the extended family can be brought into it and the young people just encouraged to express their feelings and to get in touch with what they are feeling so that they can do that grieving. They'll never get totally beyond it, but they won't get stuck in it the way so many of us did.
And my feeling is that if they go through a process of grieving early on, even though somebody said in one of the other groups, in different developmental stages, you have to probably have to do that again, but they'll be more familiar with that, and maybe will be willing to go for counseling as, you know, when those times come up, rather than wait, 20 years or whatever.
Yes, I've done a lot of work with people in various grieving situations, and right now I'm doing a group where I have 2 or 3 women who are grieving the loss of their sons who died at between 18 and 20. And it's like, it's helping me to understand these different processes. It's like whenever we had to grieve not only the relinquishment, but when we knew that our child would be entering school, we grieved. When we knew he was going to be graduating from school, we grieved. When we figured maybe they were getting married, we grieved. And the same way for a parent who loses a child through death. Each little stage, they're going to have to go through that grief process all over again. Because the loss of a child is not natural. We can resolve the death of a parent, the death of a sibling, the death of a friend, the death of a spouse more easily because it's further along the line. But part of the reason parents who lose a child to death can't have great difficulty with it is it's unnatural. We don't expect to outlive our children. And for the birth mother, we're forced into that situation immediately, in a sense. That this just isn't the way it's supposed to be. So there are all these different stages that we have to go through over and over and over, each developmental stage.
Do you see openness helping, and at what levels? Because part of me wonders if I see openness as healthy, but then I back up sometimes and I think, are we just prolonging the point of where they're going to have to let go and have grief? Because
I mean, as far as the birth parents
the
are
birth parent's
concerned?
beginning to deal with it, the person who is delaying the grief, who is...
There's going to be grief,
Yes.
no matter what. But unresolved grief and resolvable grief are very different. And suppressed grief can lead to all these other problems. I feel it's part of the whole secrecy thing. I would rather know anything. I don't care how awful it is. I would rather know it because I can imagine much, much worse. I mean, that was, for me, one of the worst things about not knowing where my child was. And I know that is for most birth parents. Every time you hear of something that's happened to a child, you wonder if it's yours. And it just, the idea of not knowing if he was seriously sick or if he had died or if, something awful had happened to him. And you can imagine every possible thing. So I think openness just is, there can't be too much. I think there is a definite difference with older adopted children. I'm talking about infants. With children who already know their birth family and who are removed with neglect and sexual abuse and things like that. It's a different issue. Yes?
I'm a birth mother and my adult son recent, 2 years ago, had a child with his girlfriend in high school. And he doesn't seem to, feel that was, he was like filling out his adopted script. He doesn't seem to really, feel any grief or loss. I really don't understand his behavior,
Have you been feeling grief and loss?
Yes, and it was really strong at first. I sort of, kind of, put it aside for a while, but I really felt a lot of anger towards him about it.
Sometimes we do it for them. We can do the grieving for other people. There might be some element of that. Other elements may be that he's just not ready to look at it. I know it was years. In fact, it was not all that long ago that I began to really see the pattern of my own relinquishment in connection with being an adoptee. And people talk about the way it's a way of bonding with your birth mother, getting back at your adoptive mother, all kinds of things like that. And for myself, I decided that in part, my relinquishment was an attempt to redo my adoptive experience in a better way because I found parents. I chose them. Didn't work out the way I'd planned, but I found them. So that was one way of redoing it, and then the other part of it was to justify my own adoption, to make it okay that I was adopted because I knew how I felt about my son. And if I felt that way about my son, then maybe my birth mother felt that way about me. I mean, it's all stuff that I, would gladly undo in a second. And that was something I had to do with my son, too. When we first had a reunion, he asked me, did I ever wish that I hadn't given him up and that he'd grown up with me? And I can't believe I did it, but I said, I went into a total automatic pilot, denial, everything else, and I said, oh, I don't feel that way at all. I know it was the best thing for both of us, and I never thought for a minute that I wanted to make it any different. And about 7 years later, I realized what I'd said, and it just haunted me. And the next time I saw him, I said, there's really something I have to talk to you about. Do you remember the conversation we had when? And he said, yes. And I said, I just have to tell you that it was complete bullshit. And he said, yeah, it was. And I said, I have to tell you, I am sorry. I have to apologize deeply to you. I was wrong. I should never have done it. And I've regretted it all my life. And I want to be honest about that fact. And it changed our relationship. He said he'd been waiting to hear that. I had to own my own part in that. When I found him, it was about 2 years after the Adoption Triangle had come out, and there were no support groups or anything that I knew of. That was the only book I'd ever read, and I had no support around it at all. And when I finally got into a support group a few years ago, I realized that I was very lucky that my son hadn't just left and never had anything more to do with me, because it was really the blind leading the blind, and neither of us knew what we were doing, and we really made some mistakes, but we've been able to talk about them since and kind of forgive ourselves for our ignorance. Yes?
I'm a birth parent and found my son, who's 24 now, about a year and a half ago. And I guess I'm one of the fortunate ones his adoptive parents thanked me for the gift that I gave them. And I'd like to share something that she wrote and read at his 24th birthday last in December in front of his whole family. And to me, she said thank you to me, and this is my thank you to her, that she gave me this gift. If you don't mind.
Would you like to read it up here so it would be sure and get on the tape?
I'm nervous already. Legs are shaking. Go for it, Ellen. Who's here? Hi, Judy. Yeah, she thanked me, and I want to thank her for this publicly.
This is the Inside A. Please turn your tape over at this time.
And she's from California, I'm from Connecticut. Two women, one son. And she's from California, I'm from Connecticut, and she picked this beautiful place on the Pacific coast for us to meet, and we talked for hours. Two women sitting in the sand facing the Pacific sun. Two hearts sending out feelers of friendship through fears and pains. One with a loving and broken heart had released her newborn son to the unknown other. The other with a joyful heart and trembling arms had received the baby boy to raise as her only son. Sorrow, yearning, emptiness, pain, hope, acceptance, joy, and peace. Missing pieces lost and found, love and healing the wounds surround. Two mothers sitting in the sun, bound by their love for one young man. Two hearts, two women, one son. I just thought that's the best thank you I could ever get.
Yeah, thank you for sharing it with us. Any other questions at this point?
I'd just like to make a comment.
Yes?
You asked her if she was grieving for her son, but I would ask, is she grieving for the grandchild?
No, that's
I meant
Okay.
yeah, that's what for both of them,
Correct.
all of them. Barbara?
I'd like to say something about anger. When we were talking about anger before and wanting your son to be angry and get out the passion. When I found my son too, I can recall begging him to be angry, even if he wanted to hit me. I would have liked it. I mean, this would have been something, you know, other than just saying, no, everything's fine. I had a great life. This is great. I didn't want to hear that. I wanted to hear, I missed you. I really wanted you to be my mother. I didn't want to hear, no, you were only a kid anyway. You would have screwed up my life. I really wanted to hear him say just the opposite. And when I would ask him, aren't you ever angry about this at all? He would say, I don't get mad, I get even. And he wasn't kidding. But another point about that is the fact that he was raised in a home where they never displayed anger at all. They never had an argument. He only speaks of one argument that they ever had when it was talking about being late or early, and the mother said, I won't go if you remind me of that again, and in that tone of voice. And that's the only argument I ever remember my parents having. And to me, that isn't even a good discussion. Because I'm feisty, you know, and so is he, but he's been not feisty all his life, trying to be their son. And it's been a very difficult chore, I think, to be what they want him to be and what he wants to be. He wants to be their child. And I think it's been very tough to have one personality that he's been continually trying to fit into these very even Swedish people. So I look like a calm, even Swedish person. So it's a real battle to get them to really deal with those feelings.
Well, as this, I keep switching hats all the time, and I do it all the time in my head too, trying to figure out which is a birth mother reaction, which is adoptee talking in me when I'm feeling things. As an adoptee, I think I spent a lot of my childhood being angry with my birth parents, but by the time I started looking for them, I really wasn't angry. I don't know what would have happened if they'd been alive. Maybe I could have expressed some anger. Most of my anger was that they were dead, and I really felt cheated about that. And I do think, for those of you who are searching and having reunions, it's a very different process for adoptees and for birth mothers. It's extremely different. I think part of it is that we as birth mothers, we were thinking conscious human beings when this was going on. We may have gone into, we may have left our bodies and blocked out the whole experience and all that, but we still had cognitive capabilities while this was happening. The adoptee is sitting in the womb, feeling all these feelings with no way to process any of it. And everything that the adoptee has gone through in this relinquishment process has been pre-verbal, if not prenatal. And there's just, I can be very articulate about my feelings as a birth mother. When I start trying to talk about my feelings as an adoptee, I just woo, because so much of it is it's just feeling without words. It's very hard to sort out that experience and put it into a verbal form. And for that reason, I think the reunion experience has a very different effect, and I think it's much slower for the adoptee to get the full impact of what is going on. For a birth mother, it can be almost instantaneous. I mean, that incredible relief of knowing your child is alive and knowing that he's a real person. But for the adoptee, it's a whole process of slowly beginning to believe that you really were born. I always felt I'd crawled out from under a rock, and it's taken a couple of years to get to the point where I really am beginning to believe that. Yeah, I was born. I know he was born, there was no doubt of that. But I never knew whether I was or not. And so keep in mind that it is very different. Doesn't make it any less wonderful. And I wouldn't, I couldn't begin to say if I had to only have one of them, which one it would be. I suppose my instant reaction would be that I would want my son. But having this family and this brother is so important to me. I can't tell you how important this brother is. And both of these two men were so important to my life because there was somebody that looked like me. And they're the only ones. The half siblings don't look like me. But it's a very different process, and keep that in mind when you're dealing with your children, your adult children, because they are going through a different process, and it's much harder for them to verbalize about it.
Why is that?
Because their feelings were, when they were infants, they had no language. They couldn't think the way we think. They didn't have the kind of consciousness. It wasn't developed yet. So you have all these amorphous feelings floating around, but it's very hard to put them into a verbal context because you had no verbal ability when you felt them.
But even after they become adults, it's still difficult for them
To verbalize about those feelings, yeah.
I think so because we weren't always birth mothers. We were something else before that.
Mm-hmm.
As adoptees, you weren't. You've always been an adoptee. You don't know anything different than that. You don't have anything to compare that to.
And remember, too, that they're finding so much more about prenatal reactions. A baby can hear when it's 6 months. The fetus can hear when it's 6 months. It can recognize voices, it can distinguish voices, and it doesn't have the thinking ability, but it's sensitive. And if you think as a birth mother of all the conflicting emotions that were going on, it happens enough with anyone who's pregnant. But I think for a birth mother, the terror, the anger, the fear, the rejection, the grief, everything that you were feeling at that time transmitted itself to your child. And that child carries that with them on a very unconscious level. And it's pretty hard to begin to verbalize about it. And I think when we do have a reunion, then a lot of those feelings are triggered, and it's why a lot of adoptees have a hard time around the reunion. They don't, because there just aren't words to describe those feelings. They may be creeping into consciousness for the first time. Yes?
I'm wondering a little bit, if you tell us a little bit more about your process of sorting this out. I'm also an adoptee and a birth mother, and I haven't had a reunion.
I don't know if I can.
But I know in just my beginning to search for my daughter, I kept running into roadblocks, which was dealing with I'm actually a step-parent adoptee, just one. It's a big impact on my life. It's just so complicated, and sorting out, it's like the two strands of grief. Did you look first for your parents before you dealt with your son?
Yeah, I started that with the idea that my son was getting close to being 18 and he might look for me. The search was interrupted when his adoptive family contacted me. That was another miracle, because I told him that I wouldn't have looked for him because I didn't feel I had the right, and he told me that he would never look for me because he thought it was my job to look for him. So bless his adoptive family 1,000-fold. My excuse was that I wanted to look for him, but it was much scarier in some respects to look for my own birth family than it was to look for him, the idea of looking for him, although I didn't really have to face that. I don't know. I really don't know. They're equally terrifying. Yes?
I'm an adopted mother, and my son had a successful reunion with his other mother this year and his other father as well. And where the process is right now touches on some of the things you're saying, because I see him pulling back, not giving Cynthia all that she would like and needs to have from him right now. And for me, in the process, it's really painful to watch more grief happening because she can't get as much as she wants right this minute. And yet, if I say, Seth, why don't you? Then he backs away altogether. And I think it's because he did this process, he got as much as he could assimilate right this minute, and now he has to back off and put it in. But it's a very hard juncture, and I don't know how to help her or me, because I'm very identified with what she's feeling right this minute. And I just wonder if you could talk about that.
I think the most you can do is to make it clear that it's okay for him to love her too.
That's not what it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, it can't be forced. And to reassure her that, you know, he'll do things in his own time. It's difficult for us to stand back as birth parents, because we want to make up for all those years all at once. And it's just part of the process. We move close and then we pull back. It's like in any system of people, we don't just stay static. And sometimes when we move real close, we get scared and we have to pull back. It's a fear of intimacy. And aside from labeling some of it, talking about, well, maybe this is what's happening, you can't force it. How old is your son? 24. Yeah. And of course, men are notoriously labeled as non-sensitive and not in touch with their feelings, and so it's very hard for some of them to get in touch with those feelings and acknowledge them and let them happen. And of course, us birth mothers are all over the place. You know, we're just spilling our guts everywhere. So it can be kind of a heavy trip for a kid, too.
Also, it's been suggested that male adoptees have more anger than female adoptees with the birth mother.
I guess I've heard that. I don't really know. Did they say why?
No, just that they feel very unmothered. They just have that feeling that female adoptees often have.
I don't know. I felt pretty unmothered. Yes?
Could you talk a little bit, you alluded to it when you were talking about passion, and somebody else said something also just now, that the feelings of closeness that that I felt that I really needed to have with my son. I mean, I would really like to just hold him until I felt as if, okay, that part was resolved. But I can't. He's a grown man. And I feel like when he's with me, he doesn't want to leave. So he must have that same kind of a need. And then he doesn't call for a couple weeks because he's pulled back.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I'm trying to get at some kind of a discussion of those feelings of passion or that are frightening.
Would you like to nurse it? Did you have a sense that you'd like to nurse it?
No, I haven't had that feeling. I just wanted to hold it.
Where? Can you hold it?
Okay, all right. I would hold his head in my lap. I would, you're right.
And do you think that he might want to do that with you?
Yes,
And how long have you been in the room?
2 years.
Do you think, can you conceive that might happen at some point in time? And if you said to him, you know, I've got this thing and I really feel as though I need to put into language. I really would like to hold you in my lap. How does that sound to you? What do you think you might say?
I can't imagine. Well, you see, I think that's part of what I felt the night of the reunion, which is why I had to move away from him. But I can't imagine. I don't know. It just doesn't seem.
I think that the poem that was read earlier is just, you might look again at that.
Yeah.
You know, we live in a Western society, and there's no way you're going to hurt your son, there's no way he's going to hurt you. But somehow or other we get into this Western model that we forget about smelling the orchids, that there's some healing going on here. In many grief work that I've ever seen done in groups, they all hold each other, but because there's this grown child and this birth mother, we somehow ever feel as though you assert both sides. There needs to be permission on both sides. But I think to acknowledge in the right moment, at the right time, that our bodies want to connect sometimes. I think it's not important. It's one of the things that's...
You know, that's really interesting because my husband has always liked those kinds of group kinds of therapy things where they touch each other, you know, the feely kind of, and I always stayed away from that. Maybe that's because I'm a birth mother, you know. It was too scary, and maybe you're right.
I don't know. This is something
Very
that is
interesting
in my
to think
picture
about.
too.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to deny it.
Have you ever done that?
No, but it's something that I feel as though he and I would both like to do.
Yeah.
And we've talked about it over the phone. We're living a long way away from each other. And we've both decided that we feel as though after 5 years we might be ready to sit down and try putting this into language. And I'm not going to be afraid of it anymore because I think he and I are both wonderful, wonderful.
I went to the movies with my son a week and a half ago. It was our second visit. And I remember at one point our arms were touching. And I just thought, our arms are touching, you know? And I'm sure he knew our arms were touching. And it was like we both consciously kept our arms together. It was so strange.
I have a friend who just had a reunion recently with her family, and she told me the other day that she was sitting in the kitchen one night and her birth mom came up and stroked her hair, and she said that was the most wonderful thing, that it just, of all the things that have happened, that was the thing that really, really got to her. It felt so wonderful. And I think it's that kind of thing. I think we get scared sometimes. There's another workshop happening, I think it's tomorrow, Barb, right? On the sexual part. And sexual part is important to recognize. I don't think necessarily wanting to hold your son's head against your breast is a sexual act. And as long as both of you are clear about your boundaries and stuff, it's not going to move on into incest, but we have to be careful about it. When I met my brother, God, I wanted, for one thing, I wanted to rip his socks off and see if his feet were like mine. And I waited, you know. So I finally got him in sandals. I could see his feet. And it was like I wanted to know whether his body was like mine, but there was no way I could do that. And I thought he was the biggest hunk I'd ever seen. And we would walk around with our arms around each other and holding hands and stuff like that. And it just felt so good. But both of us were, in an unspoken way, we were real clear about our boundaries. And we knew that it wasn't going to go in any other direction. He was a little concerned about me because he had a girlfriend, but I didn't have anybody. So he was wondering. He used to ask me about every 2 weeks, have you found anybody yet? And I knew he was talking. He was a little worried about this. But I mean, especially with siblings in a reunion process. I mean, kids, when they're growing up as brothers and sisters, you do all this kind of stuff, and there's this urge to play. And we just have to be aware of it. It's not a bad urge. It's just that we don't act on it in an adultly sexual way. We act on it in a childly sexual way and hold hands and kiss and, you know, rumple hair and stuff like that. But we don't have to carry it into a physical sexual relationship in an adult manner, no matter how nice it sometimes would feel.
I know I just jumped in, but I'm an adoptee, and I just had my reunion with my birth mother and birth father. They're not married. And I gained 6 sisters. So my reunion included all these sisters, and you can imagine in one house it's kind of hectic. And I just wanted to spend the whole time with my mother. I was thrilled with my 6 sisters, but they would all go to bed, and my mother and I would go sit in bed together and try to catch up and talk. And I wanted to be tucked in. She tucked me in one night. I wanted my hair brushed, and one night we slept together. We just talked till the wee hours, and it felt good. It felt
Mm-hmm.
good.
What better than your father?
Well, I imagine I would have gone with it. I had my reunion with my birth father. He's more reserved. You know, had he been as affectionate as my mother is,
I mean,
That's my point.
but
And like she said, the
I
stroking
would
the
have
hair.
liked those moments. I want those moments. I want to recapture.
Mm-hmm.
No, the point I was making is because, we say, well, that isn't sexual, but it becomes sexual sometimes just because it's the opposite sex. And when your mother strokes, just would stroke your hair or something, fine, but if your father did that, it takes on a whole new meaning. If you say, yeah, I would like to hold my son to my breast, but it wouldn't mean anything, it might to him, but if it was your daughter, you'd probably think nothing of that. I have known mothers and daughters that have stripped naked and gone to bed together just to be skin to skin, thought nothing of it. And people would say, well, why'd you do that with your son? It's, oh, really? You see him running now and never coming back. But it's just not the same. So what does it become? It does become a sexual feeling, and it's something that we try to deny that we're feeling, that it could be sexual. I know the minute my son walked into the room, I'll try to talk about all this tomorrow at the workshop, but the minute he walked into the room, I became a sexual, seductive 16-year-old girl. And I could never get out of that frame of mode anytime I was with him.
Yes.
I was reading an article about that same thing, though, about how fathers relate to their daughters, and there's a difference between sexual and sensual, and the fact that maybe you want to hold your son, against you, that might be a little sensual, but that's okay if you're talking about a son. He's close to you, he's a part of you. It's naturally if you raise him.
Yeah, I think almost anything is okay as long as both people are really aware of it, and what your boundaries are. But both people have to know what their boundaries are, which means you've got to do some talking. You don't just walk up and grab them and expect nothing sexual to happen. Because part of the time, we're relatively close in age to our children. And many of them have been in adoptive homes where their parents are considerably older than we are. So it can lead to problems. Back there.
Just a couple of things in sort of listening to what everyone's been saying. It strikes me that we've all thrown ourselves into kind of an unnatural situation to begin with by entering into adoption. And so a lot of these feelings that are all coming up, we try to label and funnel into the normal roads of life, but we don't really fit into that. And so you're dealing with these feelings and saying, well, maybe it's sexual, maybe it's sensual, but it's really a whole new group of feelings and a whole, real basic need to connect. When I found my birth family, we did look at our ears and our feet, and that's a real key. You're going back to beginning with something that you lost, both as an adoptee and as birth parents. And it can become really confusing because we're on a new path, all of us. We can't fit in with what we've known all those years, or what I thought all those years and you thought all those years. And then, if I may just also, for one tiny second, just say two small stories from different groups that I lead a group and I go to different groups and listen to people speak. And I listened to a birth mother the other day who reunited with her son not too long ago. And they spent the whole evening sitting on the couch together after they waited for the son's wife to go to bed. And this for her was like the most amazing moment of her life. And you can just see and feel it coming out of her body. And she said she raised above her body and just looked down and looked at the ballet of their bodies. They sat together, and then they sat with his head on her lap, and then they held each other, and they just talked. And I thought that was so beautiful. And then one other story I heard was from a male adoptee who's actually got some art pieces in that exhibit, and he said, he came to meetings and hardly said anything until one night he opened up and he said, a moment that was so precious to me was I was having breakfast with my birth father, and he was having this very strange cereal with stuff on top. Didn't know what it was, and they weren't, speaking. I was just sitting there eating, and he took a spoonful and reached over and fed it to his son. And he said, for a moment, I was a child again. And I think as an adoptee, that's important. There's feelings and connections like that. I think, for instance, that your son is probably longing to be held by you as much as inside you are by him. And that's part of our healing process. That's part of the nature of us as people. The nature that was taken away identify the unnatural thing that we are into.
How much time do we have left? 15 minutes. I don't want to get too much into Barbara's workshop. We don't want to have it today instead of tomorrow. So maybe a few more questions, and then maybe we'll do a little guided visualization. Yes?
I want to go back to something. There was a question asked about open adoption and whether that helps. I'm going through an open adoption right now. My daughter is 3, and the adoption was extremely open. I saw her and her family last May on our vacation. We spent more time together than right, and we're free to call. We don't do that much. We do call occasionally. And I don't know if that's helped the grief process at all. It's kind of why I'm here, just to make sure that I've done it. I'm starting to think that maybe I haven't. And I think that feeling that she's there and that I can see her, it might delay it a little bit, because you don't come into it, you don't come into contact with those feelings right away, because you have a picture to look at. And it doesn't occur to me all the time that I've lost her, that she's gone, because I have her. So I'm kind of here just to make sure, just to kind of feel that out and see if I've done it.
If you've done what?
Resolved it. I don't know if I have.
She's only 3. You haven't resolved it.
I know. I don't even
know.
know if I started. To tell you the truth, the day she was born, or the day after she was born, was when I relinquished her. My roommate came to get me at the hospital, and I said, I'm hungry. And she said, what do you want to eat? And I said, well, we're at Taco Bell. And we went to have Taco Bell, and I went to my brother's, and we all just kind of sat around and didn't do much of anything. I was kind of joking and laughed. And I thought that was my day to do that, but I'm kind of wondering maybe that was my 3 years ago.
Yeah, I'm sure it helps to be able to see her and know that she's alive and well.
It does help. I don't know if it solves it.
No, I don't think anything solves it. But you're doing well. Yes.
How do you know when you resolved it?
If you get the feeling that you've probably resolved it, I'd say, wait. The thunderclap will come. I never know when it's going to hit me. I mean, I have to pick and choose the TV programs I watch, because, I mean, all I have to do is see a reunion on the television and I'm in tears again. It's that shadow grief stuff. I mean, it can be some little remark on a sitcom or something, and I fall apart. Remember, there was one sitcom about an adoptive family, and it used to drive me nuts. I'm glad it went under. They said some pretty stupid things on it. But, I never know when it's going to hit me. And I work with emotionally disturbed kids, and they get me all the time. I just assume that it's going to happen. I know that I'm a lot better off than I was 5 or 6 years ago. A lot more. But I don't expect it to ever not feel sadness around it. Even when I'm with them, especially when I'm with them, I don't know. But it's not as obsessive as it used to be. I used to have terrible dreams when I would feel his arms around my neck, and I'd always be looking for him. I couldn't find him. And once I had the reunion, I never had those dreams again. So that was progress. That was healing. And I think I've forgiven myself around it. Sometimes when I'm really down on myself, I don't, but most of the time I've forgiven myself. But, I don't expect it to ever just to be able to say I'm healed totally. And of the big part of it, I think a lot of my healing came from doing the dissertation. And it was an incredible experience, because I knew I would cry. And the questionnaires would come, and I'd read the questionnaires and I'd cry. I cried over every single questionnaire. And I thought, okay, that's done. But no, every time I had to do anything with the questionnaires, of processing them, writing the dissertation, reading it to a friend, talking about it in my orals, anytime, I'd dissolve in tears. And there's still, when I go back to certain parts of that, the quotes from some of the birth mothers, I'll cry every time. I know it. It's partly why I didn't bring some. But I think that's good. That's part of the healing.
Can I offer something here?
Mm-hmm.
In my own process, I finally, it's really hard for me to come up with this because it just was amazing. A good friend of mine finally came up to me and she said, I know you're working really hard on this. And she said, you know what? She said, I think that you really need some help with this. And she guided me into getting in touch with someone, and I started taking food supplements. And on a cellular level, the grief was so intense. And Jenny can testify, I was in such deep grief for so long. After I started taking iron and calcium and B complex, if anyone's in deep grief and they feel they need a little, get in touch with someone who knows what they're doing with food supplements, because I think it does. I think he's right. On a cellular level, I think that I was really malnourished. And it really helped a lot. I'm still doing all this. It doesn't keep me numb from being able to do the inner work. But I don't feel as though I can't do it anymore. I like life again. So, and all it wants is doing something. So,
Yeah. Yeah, it's like grief will prey on your immune system. It lowers your resistance to disease. And grief is tiring. It's exhausting, whether you're dealing with it or not. If you're repressing it, it takes so much energy to repress it that you are draining your immune system. And if you're expressing it, you're using up energy too. And so it's very important, I think, to look to those things and to take special good care of yourself, because you are susceptible to a lot of diseases because of it. Yes?
I got infectious mononucleosis 6 months after I gave birth to my son. Was violently ill. I mean, I was hospitalized and developed Epstein-Barr virus. I've been tested repeatedly for Lyme disease, for lupus, for MS, for everything you can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
And it was only when I got in touch with my depression and my grief that my immune system cleared up.
Mm-hmm.
So
And I think maybe, I don't have any statistics on the amount of respiratory type stuff that birth mothers have, but I would suspect that we have a lot of that kind of disease because we're not supposed to talk because of the secret. And when you shut off in an emotional sense, that part of the body can easily get affected. And I've seen it with incest victims as well. Anybody that's required to keep a secret in some deep sense like that can, bronchitis or emphysema or all kinds of respiratory type things can happen. Yes?
Along those lines, have you ever run across any statistics or seen anyone has any numbers about alcoholism, the incidence of alcoholism and drug dependence amongst birth mothers?
It's very high, yeah. It's a way of dealing with the pain. Plus, a high percentage of them came from substance abusing families to begin with. There was lots of alcoholism in the families. Yes?
Yeah, I came in relate, I don't know if you addressed this, but birth mothers who then are later, after they relinquish, are unable to conceive again.
Yes, in my study, which was higher than the Cub study, was 44% had secondary infertility. It was very high, yes.
What were the ages of your birth mothers?
The range was from 18 to 85.
Did you find that the younger birth mothers were dealing with the grief any better because of the lack of stigma?
What I asked was that everyone have relinquished at least 5 years prior to the study. So, and I saw no evidence in any of the ones that were in it. None of them, or very few, had experience with open adoption.
But I mean, as far what I'm thinking is, like in 1964 when I relinquished, it was just, it's like you said, you didn't talk about it anymore. It was like the day I relinquished was the last time I was in conversation in my family until this past Christmas. And I can't picture that happening even in 1983 when a teen gets pregnant. Surely she shares that war with her family now because there's nothing.
I'm not sure.
And mine was, I never thought.
Mm-mm. The difference is that now more mothers can keep their kids. Because there is welfare, there is aid to dependent children, there is, more, society has more chance to help. I mean, there are more opportunities for her to be a single mom. But as far as the ones that give up, I think the social stigma is just as great.
Maybe more so in some cases, because then the peer group probably also puts them down for relinquishing.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think it's very... That part of it I don't think has improved that much at all. Yes?
I just want to offer a different perspective now about the grief. I think for me as an adopted mother, I feel, I just adopted a boy, he was born in June, he's almost a year old. But the grief that I feel knowing that his birth mother will not see his growing up, that's real strong for me. So in other words, there is, I think it's hard maybe for a birth mother to realize that an adopted mother could feel that grief also. And I've just been really listening hard because my birth mother is in Peru, it's an international adoption, and birth mothers are just treated terribly in, international adoptions because Latin countries, you're seen as like prostitutes or something like that. So it's really even worse there. And they are so far behind anything here. There's no such thing as like therapy and all this kind of stuff. So I've just been really listening hard because I would like to help her deal with what she's dealing. I think for her, I may be wrong, but I think for her, for them, relinquishing in a lot of these Latin American countries, they do it out of poverty. In other words, it's not necessarily because of social stigma, but because literally some of these women are not going to be able to feed their children. So that I think for them, sometimes they really do feel genuinely, they feel sad at doing this, but they feel they really are going to be able to give a life, for their child. They might really, their child might literally die. So I think she felt sad, but I think it was something that she felt was the right thing for her.
How many birth mothers felt that way at first when you relinquished?
Giving her a life.
A life that we couldn't give our child. Maybe not a life or death, but pretty close to it. I mean, we were told that we couldn't provide for our children, and
We were told that that's what we were doing. I said, I think we were told that that's what we were doing. But when you said how did we feel that way, I was told that's the way I was supposed to feel. But I
yeah,
didn't feel that way.
okay. Well, some of us bought it. Yes.
I didn't even have the benefit of the mythological ideal two-parent family home held out to me as something for my child. I was raped and my child's biracial. And they said, oh, she'll probably never be adopted. She'll probably, be in a foster home. They told me that. And I didn't want to do it. My parents forced me. Literally. I mean, I can't remember signing the paper, but I wouldn't be surprised if they guided my hand. So, I didn't even have that to salve my grief.
One of the things that does seem to make a difference in how birth mothers react to the relinquishment process is that if it has been a decision that they have had most or a lot of control over, they are better off than the ones who feel they were totally victimized and just forced into something totally against their will. And that's one of the positive things about searching, is that you empower yourself. You take back control, this control that was often wrested away from you because you were a minor and your parents were telling you what to do, and social workers, everybody was telling you what to do, and you didn't have any control over it. And that's one of the empowering parts of search, is that you are in control of it. And you get some of your personal power back that way.
This concludes this session. Thank you.